Hey Eagle fans, it's EaglefanKarl. This is going to be the second of my videos previewing the NFL draft and looking specifically at the needs that the Eagles have and sort of where I think that they could end up going as it relates to their pick at number 14. If you missed the first of these videos that I did, I focused on the offensive side of the football, so I'll go ahead and put a link up there in the corner. You can click on that and watch that video if you haven't seen that yet. In that video, I identified 4 needs that I think that the Eagles really have going into this draft that they need to address. 2 on offense and 2 on defense. On offense, I had said that I really think they need to look at running back and wide receiver, and then on defense, I said that I think they really need to look at cornerback and defensive end. So I took a look at some of the running backs and wide receivers in the first video, and in this one, we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of the cornerbacks and defensive ends that they could potentially take. I will say that this one is a little trickier than the wide receivers and running backs, because with wide receivers and running backs, for both of those, there's really only 3 names that come up on all the mock drafts when you're looking at who could potentially go in the first round. Defensive end and cornerbacks, they're all over the place in terms of who could potentially go in the first round. You might have a guy on one mock draft that'll go in the top 10, and in another draft he won't even go in the first round. So that's sort of what we're dealing with as it relates to this breakdown. There's a lot of variation on the different guys that are available and where they could potentially go, and that sort of raises some questions about some of the guys, frankly. I don't think there's any real surefire ones except for guys that are probably going to go before the Eagles pick. But let's go ahead and take a look at them anyway. Let's go ahead and we'll start with the cornerbacks because I think that is probably the most pressing need that the Eagles need to address in this year's draft. And if you think about it, we really haven't addressed cornerback for a first round pick in several years. And the last time we really devoted, top draft picks to it was the year we drafted both Lito Shepherd and Sheldon Brown. And we see how well that turned out for us. That was a really good draft that year. It solidified our secondary for the next several years. And I think that's sort of what we need to do in this draft. I think ideally we probably want to spend 2 of our top 3 rounds on cornerbacks. I really think that that's probably something we're going to have to do. If you look at our cornerbacks right now, there's really not a starting cornerback on the roster right now. So if you want a guy who's going to be able to start, we're either going to have to sign another free agent somewhere, or we're going to have to draft 2 cornerbacks to go ahead and start. And some of those, and that's one of the reasons why I think they really need to look probably at cornerback in the first round. Now, the only surefire cornerback as you look at this draft, in terms of everyone agrees he's going to go in the first round, is Marshon Lattimore out of Ohio State. And in fact, every mock draft I see has him going well before the Eagles pick. So I think the lowest he drops down is maybe like number 10 or 11. But I can't imagine him even getting that far. I think Marshon Lattimore will probably be far off the board before the Eagles are even picking. The next name that you see a lot about in terms of some people have him going above where the Eagles pick, and a couple mock drafts didn't even have him going in the first round, was Marlon Humphrey out of Alabama. So this is where we start to get into some of the ones where you don't really know exactly, who's better than others based on, where people are ranking them. I think a lot of different teams could think a lot of different things about all these different guys, and that could, influence where they end up going, depending on, what team is picking at that moment and where they have him ranked on their board. And so it's really going to be sort of difficult to say exactly who's going to be available for the Eagles when they draft at 14. My guess is that one of 2 things is going to happen as it relates to cornerbacks, because everything you read and hear about this draft is that it's very deep at cornerback. So the Eagles could legitimately get 2 starters out of this draft for the cornerback position. So one of 2 things I think will end up happening because it's so deep. The first possibility, which would be the best thing for the Eagles, is that everybody knows it's deep, so they're going to say, well, we don't need to take our guy now, because even if, after Marshon Lattimore, they're all sort of, many people I think would probably lump them all together, a bunch of them all together, where they're all decent, good cornerbacks, but no one's a surefire, top 10 pick. So, we'll just sort of wait and we can get a guy in the second round who's just as good as maybe a guy we'll take here in the first round. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that someone takes another cornerback in the top 10 after Marshon Lattimore, and then you start to see teams get nervous about cornerbacks and they just start flying off the board. And if you look at mock drafts, most of them will usually have one of those 2 things happening. They'll either have, maybe 3 or 4 cornerbacks going in the first round, or they'll have a ton of them going in the first round. And I think that's sort of what could potentially happen. Obviously, one is better for the Eagles than the other, but the Eagles, I think, are going to have to be ready to adapt if that starts to happen. If a cornerback goes after Marshon Lattimore, if another cornerback goes before the Eagles pick at 14, they're probably better off just taking their guy then and making sure that they get a cornerback in the first round. Because if they don't, there might be that run, in the second half of the first round, where by the time they're picking in the second round, which is the 43rd pick in the draft, by the way, if they're picking in the second round and they're going to try to get a cornerback with that 43rd pick, then it's entirely possible that, there might not be a guy like that available. So I would say if one other cornerback other than Marshon Lattimore comes off the board when the Eagles are picking, before the Eagles pick, I should say, then I think the Eagles absolutely need to take a cornerback in the first round. The most common name that you'll see associated in mock drafts with the Eagles, as I was looking at all the mock drafts, teams have them going a bunch of different ways in terms of who they could potentially pick. But the name that you see the most often associated with the Eagles, I think I reviewed like 15 mock drafts or something like that, and I think it was 5 of them had them taking this guy, and that's Gareon-Conley. Ironically, Marshon Lattimore's teammate at Ohio State. There are some people that are even saying that they think he's better than Marshon Lattimore, and given the fact that Marshon Lattimore has had some hamstring issues over the course of his career, he might actually be, a better bet that way too. So if the Eagles have drafted Gareon-Conley at 14, I'd absolutely be okay with that. I'd also be okay if they went ahead and took Marlon Humphrey. I think he's very good. I think people that have him falling out of the first round are undervaluing him. And I could certainly see that being a legitimate number 14 pick. Ironically, when I was really starting to look at this a couple months ago, the one guy I really liked was Sidney Jones out of Washington, but then he blew out his Achilles in his pro day, and now there's a good chance he might not even be able to play this year. He's probably going to drop to maybe a 3rd round pick. Maybe a team takes a chance on him in the 2nd round, but he's going to be a guy that, unfortunately, the injury is really going to hurt him, because if you draft him, you've basically got to assume that he's not going to be able to play this upcoming season. So if you're a team that has maybe aging cornerbacks, he would be a good guy to draft, because then, in 2 years, he might really be able to step into a starting role. But for this coming year, it's really going to be hard to be able to count on him playing any significant amount of time, because even if he does come back from injury sometime either right before or during the season, he's not going to be at 100%. And as a result, I just don't think that the Eagles, who have such a need at cornerback, can take a risk like that in the first round. They've got to draft someone that is going to be ready to play from day one when they pick. So obviously, putting Sidney Jones aside and assuming Gareon-Conley and Marlon Humphrey, those would be guys as well that I would go with. If those 3 guys are off the board, though, then I would entertain, if I were the Eagles, if you still wanted to get that cornerback in the first round, trading back, because I think there's a little bit of a drop-off between those 3 guys, Lattimore, Humphrey, and Conley, and some of the other guys, and they're all sort of lumped together. And if you, like I said, if you look at the mock drafts, people have them in all sorts of different orders. So any of these guys could potentially be picks for the Eagles, either later in the first round if they traded back, or in the 2nd round. And I would actually be a fan of them trading back in the first round if they were going to draft a cornerback, because if they could fall back to, like, say, pick number 20 and pick up an extra 3rd round pick, something along those lines, I think you could still get a good quality corner at number 20. And if you have another pick in the 3rd round, if this draft is that deep at cornerback, you can use one of your 2nd or 3rd round picks then on one of those other areas, and still have your 2nd or 3rd round pick that you already have to address some of the other needs that we talked about, like wide receiver, running back, and then, of course, I'm going to talk about in a moment, defensive end. So you could use one of those picks then, and wouldn't have to use one of 3 picks on cornerbacks, 2 of 3 picks on cornerbacks in the first 3 rounds. You could use 2 of 4 picks in the first round on cornerbacks. And that would be, I think, a great way to go if the Eagles could figure out a way to trade back in that first round and pick up an extra 3rd round pick, say. And I think that would be a huge way for us to go ahead and maybe really solidify the secondary and still address some of the other needs that we have on this team. So I am a fan of trading back if it does fall that way. There's a lot of other names that are possibilities for cornerbacks in the first round. You'll see a guy like Kevin King from University of Washington, Sidney Jones's teammate actually. That's one possibility. Some of the other possibilities are the two guys from Florida, Quincy Wilson and Tease Tabor. Those are also legitimate possibilities to draft in the first round. You also have Tre'Davious White and Adoree Jackson. Those are also guys that some draft boards have going in the first round. All of these guys, like I said, that group of guys, if we were going to draft one of them, I would actually prefer that we fall back rather than taking one of those guys at 14. If we were going to take a cornerback in the first round, I think we could trade back in the first round and still pick up one of those guys and then maybe get another draft pick. I would not want to pick one of those guys at 14, but so if we're going to pick a cornerback at 14, it'd be one of the other ones that I've already mentioned. But for that list of those list of guys, if we traded back in the first round and got one of those, I'd be thrilled with that pick. As it relates to defensive end, there's a lot of different ways the Eagles could go in terms of drafting in the first round or in the second round. Once again, if you're going to draft a defensive end in the first round, given the talent, you might be better off trading back because some of the guys that are the obvious top picks in terms of defensive end in this draft are probably not going to be there. Certainly Myles Garrett, everyone says he's probably going to go number 1. Solomon Thomas, if he's not going to go number 2, he's probably certainly going to go on the top 5 or at least the top 10. So he's not a possibility for the Eagles. And then there's some other guys that are sort of pegged towards the end of this first round. But there's one guy that if he's available to the Eagles at 14, then everything I've said about wide receivers, I'd be okay with them taking in the first video I did, or in this video, cornerbacks, I'd be okay with them taking. If this guy's available, he's absolutely the one guy I think the Eagles should take, and that's Derek Barnett out of Tennessee. He's the guy that I think that is absolutely worth taking at the 14th pick if he falls that far. Now, there's a good chance he won't be available because a lot of people have him going in the top 10. Like I said, I looked at 15 mock drafts. I think in 9 of those drafts, he was taken before the Eagles, and in 6 of them, he was available where the Eagles were picking. So that's, that's something that's going to be interesting to watch, is whether or not Derek Barnett is available. If Derek Barnett is available, I think we scrap everything and we go ahead and take him. Otherwise, and I think that it's going to be highly unlikely that he would go, but he would be the one guy going into this draft that if the Eagles drafted him and, put all the other needs aside, I think it would be great. We've needed a true defensive end who's going to be able to, rush the passer and also play the run game. Derek Barnett is very good at playing both the run and the pass, so he's a 3-down defensive end. He's not going to be one of these pass rush specialists like your Vinny Curry or someone like that who's going to be very limited in how much you can use him. He's a guy that you can use on all 3 downs. He would be great then on the opposite side from Brandon Graham, so we would have 2 legitimate pass rushing threats on each side of the line. So that would be the pick that I would love to see them make because they really don't have a solid defensive end beyond Brandon Graham. And he really, if you look at it, has only had 1 good season. So it's going to be interesting to see if Brandon Graham continues that. But it's really, I think that's a position that we really need to address is defensive end. Like I said, it's very unlikely that the Eagles will be able to draft Derek Barnett in the first round because I don't think he'll fall to them. But so the other guy that sort of is, there's some interesting names though that the Eagles could draft in the first round, or there's a name that I've seen associated with a couple of the mock drafts that go past the first round. There's not many of them, but a few of them go past the first round. They'll maybe do a 3-round mock draft or something like that. The other name that I have seen on a few draft boards that they have the Eagles taking in the second round is Jordan Willis out of Kansas State. That would also be a way that they could go. They could draft a cornerback in the first round, take Jordan Willis in the second round, and I think that would be fantastic if we're addressing our 2 biggest needs on the defensive side of the football with the first 2 picks in the draft, and I think that would be great. Some other names in terms of defensive ends the Eagles could potentially take. Once again, probably if they were going to take one of these guys, though, they'd probably want to trade back to take him because they're really not pegged to go as high as 14. Would be Tech McKinley out of UCLA or Charles Harris out of Missouri. Those are 2 other solid defensive ends that if the Eagles traded back and drafted in the second half of the first round, I think would be good quality picks as well. And once again, if they did that and picked up an extra third-round pick, they could still then address the cornerback issue. So those are my thoughts on the draft for this year and the defensive needs that the Eagles have. Let me know what you think. Do you think I'm nuts for wanting them to take a defensive end in the first round if Derek Barnett's available? Would you like them to draft Derek Barnett? Or would you prefer they just stick with cornerback and get a good, solid cornerback? Or do you disagree with what I was saying in terms of some of the offensive players and think maybe they should go running back? I know a lot of Eagles fans want the Eagles to take one of the top running backs in this draft. If you didn't watch it again, like I said, check out my video when I did the offensive side of the football. I think they should stay away from running back in the first round, regardless of who it is. And if they're going to go offense, go wide receiver. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Obviously, I'll check in after the draft. Let you know what I think about the picks that they did make. Until then, fly Eagles fly.